Hey everyone, welcome back. It's time for another deep dive. And this one's really got me thinking. We're talking about whiteness in Latin America. And I have to admit, a lot of my assumptions are being challenged as we go through
It's
this.
a topic that a lot of folks don't think about.
We've got this academic paper,
Yeah.
not just color, whiteness, nation, and status in Latin America. And it's really making me question a lot of things.
This paper is fascinating. It dives deep into how whiteness, how it's experienced in a region where,
Yeah.
like, ideas about race can be so different from other parts of the world.
Okay, so the paper's based on this massive survey. Across 17 Latin American countries, they asked people how they racially identify.
Wow.
And the results are surprising. There's huge variation in who considers themselves white,
Really?
depending on the country. I mean, that alone makes me wonder, like, what does whiteness even mean in this
Yeah,
context?
and that's one of the main points the paper makes.
Yeah.
You know, whiteness, it's not just about skin color. It's a really complex mix of historical context, social status,
Mm.
even who you're talking to at that very moment is like this invisible script people are constantly adapting to.
Hmm. So it's way more fluid than we often think.
Much more fluid.
One thing that really jumped out at me was this idea of money whitens. You know, the idea that wealth can somehow elevate your racial status.
Right. It's a common saying. But you know what's fascinating is that this study actually found the opposite in some cases.
Really?
Yeah. In countries like Peru, Mexico, and Nicaragua, people with higher education were actually less likely to identify as white.
So it completely throws a wrench in that money whitens concept.
It does this.
Totally. I mean, wouldn't you think that if you had more education, you'd be more likely to lean into whatever advantages, whiteness might bring?
You'd think.
But it's almost like they're rejecting that, maybe becoming more aware of the inequality that's tied to racial categories.
That's one possible explanation. The researchers suggest that, higher education might lead to a greater understanding of kind of the historical and social dynamics of race and a rejection of the systems that perpetuate white privilege.
So instead of trying to cash in their social capital, they might be choosing to align with groups that have been historically marginalized.
Exactly. And, this could speak to a broader shift in how younger generations are thinking about race and identity.
That makes a lot of sense. The paper also talks about what they call white nations, specifically Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, and Costa Rica. Apparently, they have a broader range of skin tones that are considered white compared to other Latin American countries.
And they attribute that to a few things. History of European immigration, national ideologies that really emphasize whiteness, and a social structure where certain privileges were tied to being seen as white. It's almost like the concept of whiteness expanded to encompass a wider range of people.
So in those countries, it's less about specific skin color and more about aligning with a national identity. That's been historically linked to whiteness.
Precisely.
Wow.
And that shows just how much context matters
Mm.
when we're talking about race.
Yeah.
It's not this fixed thing,
Right.
but something that's constantly being shaped by social and historical forces.
Yeah, this is already making me rethink everything I thought I knew about race. The paper also talks about the shift from mestizaje to multiculturalism and how that's affecting racial identification. Can you explain what those terms mean?
Sure. Mestizaje is this idea of celebrating racial mixing, which was really popular in many Latin American countries, after periods of more overt racism. It was seen as a way to kind of promote national unity.
Yeah.
But in recent decades, there's been this move towards multiculturalism, which focuses more on recognizing and valuing distinct racial and ethnic identities.
And how does that shift tie into how people identify racially?
Well, one of the key findings was that younger people are less likely to identify as white than older generations. The researchers think this might be linked to the growing acceptance of non-white identities under this more multicultural framework.
So as multiculturalism gains traction, there's less pressure to conform to a white norm.
Exactly. And this points to how societal values and global trends can have a real impact on individual identities.
It's fascinating how all of these pieces fit together. Okay, this next finding totally blew my mind. Get this. The study found that people were more likely to identify as white when the person interviewing them had darker skin.
Wow. That is interesting.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It really is. It's a fascinating insight into how relational our identities can be. It's as if when faced with someone who is more visibly non-white, we're more likely to emphasize our own whiteness, even subconsciously.
So it's like this automatic way of establishing difference, or maybe even reinforcing social hierarchies, even if we don't realize we're doing it.
It's certainly a possibility. And it highlights just how subtle and complex these racial dynamics can be.
Yeah, I'm starting to see how much I take for granted about how race works. The paper goes on to look at a few specific countries that really illustrate how unique histories can shape racial categories. Let's start with the Dominican Republic. What's going on there?
The Dominican Republic is a fascinating case. They've historically embraced an indigenous past while rejecting blackness, associating it with Haiti.
So even though the population has significant African ancestry, they largely identify as Indio rather than black.
That's right. It's a prime example of how national narratives and political strategies can influence how people understand and express their own racial identity.
It makes you realize how intertwined race and national identity can be.
They can be.
It's incredible.
It raises the question, if whiteness isn't part of the dominant narrative in a particular context, how does that affect people's sense of racial identity?
That's a great question, and we'll have to explore that further. When we look at other countries, now the paper also mentions Argentina and Costa Rica, describing them as having social Darwinist national ideologies of whiteness. Can you unpack that a bit?
Sure. Both countries, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries, had policies aimed at whitening their populations. They encouraged European immigration and discouraged non-white immigration, all based on this idea that white Europeans were somehow superior.
So it was a deliberate attempt to shape the racial makeup of the nation.
Yes, and it's a dark chapter in their history, reflecting those harmful ideologies of white supremacy that were, unfortunately, prevalent at the time.
And how did that play out in terms of how people identified racially?
Well, in both countries.
Okay.
Even people with mixed ancestry, often identified as white. It's like this self-fulfilling prophecy. If the national ideal is whiteness, people will strive for it, even if it means downplaying other parts of their heritage.
It's amazing how these national narratives can have such a powerful impact on individual identities. The paper goes on to discuss how white identification plays out differently, depending on whether a country's population is mainly indigenous and white, or black and white. I'm curious to hear more about that.
Okay. Their analysis found that people are more likely to identify as white in countries with a larger Afro-descendant population, like Brazil and Panama, compared to countries with mainly indigenous populations, like Bolivia, Peru, and Mexico.
Why do you think that is?
It's a complex issue. But one possible explanation is the greater stigma associated with blackness than indigeneity in many Latin American countries. This stems from the legacy of slavery and the ways in which racial hierarchies were established and maintained.
So in places with larger Afro-descendant populations, claiming a white identity might be a way to distance oneself from that stigma.
That's a possible interpretation. It also reflects the enduring impact of colonialism and slavery, which created these deeply ingrained systems of racial hierarchy that we're still grappling with today.
It's a stark reminder that historical forces are still shaping social dynamics, even centuries later. And speaking of shifts, the study mentions Latin America moving from mestizaje to multiculturalism.
Yes, and this has interesting effects on racial identification. Mestizaje sought to blend racial differences, while multiculturalism emphasizes and values distinct identities.
And we're seeing this play out in how younger generations identify.
Right, absolutely. They're less likely to automatically identify as white, even if they could based on their appearance. They're more open to embracing non-white identities.
It feels like a significant cultural shift.
It is. It signals that the conversation about race and identity in Latin America is becoming more nuanced and complex.
I love how this deep dive is challenging so many of my assumptions. Okay, we've covered a lot, but there's still so much to explore. We'll pick up right where we left off in part 2.
So before we jump into specific countries, we're talking about mestizaje, that idea of celebrating racial mixing, and how it seems to be giving way to multiculturalism, which is more about recognizing these distinct identities. And it seems like this shift is playing out in how younger generations in Latin America identify racially.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to think about. It makes you wonder, like, if racial categories are becoming less rigid, what does that mean for the future? I'm ready to dive into more of what these researchers uncovered.
Okay, so they did this deep analysis of the data from that huge survey we mentioned, the Americas Barometer, in 2010. It included questions specifically about how people identify in terms of race and ethnicity. And they surveyed 17 Latin American countries. Guatemala and Cuba weren't included because of some limitations with the survey there. But what's cool is they used a skin color palette a tool with 11 different shades from lightest to darkest.
Interesting.
And interviewers matched the respondents' skin tone.
I see. So instead of relying on these potentially subjective descriptions, they had a more objective measure of skin color to work with?
Yeah,
Did that help them see some interesting patterns?
absolutely. It allowed them to see the relationship between skin color and racial identification and analyze how other factors, like age, education, even the interviewer's race, could influence how people identify.
Okay.
So, for example, they found a wide range in the percentage of people who identify as white across the different countries, ranging from 73% in Argentina all the way down to just 7% in Bolivia.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
It is.
I guess that reflects all those historical and social factors we've been discussing. It's almost like their history is reflected in who identifies as white in each country.
You got it.
That's amazing.
And when they looked at the average skin tone of those who identified as white in each country, it was surprisingly consistent.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it hovered around a light pinkish brown shade.
So even though the overall percentage of people identifying as white varied greatly, the skin tone considered white was relatively similar across the countries.
Right.
It suggests there's some shared understanding of what constitutes white. But as we've seen, it's not the only factor at play.
It's not.
You said they used a special statistical method to kind of isolate the impact of each factor.
They did. It's called logit regression, and it helps you understand how different factors relate to the likelihood of someone identifying as white.
Okay.
What they found, unsurprisingly, was that skin color was a strong predictor. Lighter skin meant a higher likelihood of identifying as white.
Okay.
But again, wasn't the whole story.
Right. Age and education also played a role, as we've discussed.
Yes, and the analysis confirmed those trends. Across the board, younger people were less likely to identify as white, which supports the idea that younger generations are viewing race differently.
Yeah, maybe they're less attached to those traditional hierarchies associated with whiteness, or perhaps more comfortable embracing a multicultural identity.
That's certainly possible. They also found, as we discussed earlier, that higher education was associated with a lower likelihood of identifying as white, although that varied from country to country.
Maybe with more education comes a greater awareness of inequality. Could it be that some people with higher education are choosing to align with groups that have been marginalized, rejecting the traditional advantages of whiteness?
It's a fascinating theory, and it speaks to the power of education to reshape perspectives. Another interesting finding was that in those white nations we talked about, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, and Costa Rica, people were significantly more likely to identify as white than people in other parts of Latin America, even when controlling for their actual skin color.
So national context really matters.
It really does.
If you're living in a place where whiteness has been historically privileged and promoted, you're more likely to embrace that as part of your own identity. It shows how much social context influences our ideas about race.
You put it perfectly. This study really emphasizes how race is a social construct, not just a biological fact. It's shaped by the specific context in which it's experienced.
Yeah, we need to look beyond just skin color to understand how race really works in society.
Who do?
I'm really interested in learning more about how this plays out in different countries. I know the study looked closely at a few examples, like the Dominican Republic and Brazil.
Right.
Let's start with the Dominican Republic, which is such a unique case.
It is.
Historically, they've embraced their indigenous roots while simultaneously rejecting blackness, associating it with their neighbor Haiti.
Right.
So even though a large part of their population has African ancestry, they mainly identify as Indio.
That's right.
That seems to contradict how we usually think about racial categories.
It does. They've essentially created a binary between Dominican Indio identity and Haitian blackness. It illustrates how national narratives and political strategies can shape racial categories in really unexpected ways. It's almost like they've created a national identity by choosing which parts of their racial heritage to embrace and which to reject.
So in that context, identifying as white becomes almost irrelevant.
Exactly. It's not part of their main racial framework. This highlights how race can be used to build national unity, but also to reinforce social hierarchies and historical divisions.
It's fascinating.
It is.
This study is full of these aha moments that make you question everything you thought you knew about race.
It is.
Now, what about Brazil? I remember reading about how they consider themselves a racial democracy.
Right. That's a common narrative. But this study suggests it's more complicated than that. While racial mixing is certainly prevalent in Brazil, there's still a strong preference for whiteness, especially among older generations.
So it seems like.
Yeah.
Even though they celebrate racial mixing, whiteness is still held up as the ideal.
It is.
It must be difficult to reconcile those two things.
It is. And the study suggests that this tension stems from Brazil's history of slavery and the way whiteness has been historically linked to power and privilege. Even though Brazil has a more fluid concept of race compared to some other countries, it's still grappling with the legacy of racism.
This is where that shift towards multiculturalism we talked about becomes really important.
Right, absolutely. Younger Brazilians are more likely to embrace non-white identities, challenging the traditional hierarchies that have long defined their society. They're pushing back against the idea that whiteness is the ultimate goal.
It's encouraging to see those changes happening. Their racial democracy might finally be starting to live up to its name.
That's a great way to put it. And this shift is being driven in part by affirmative action policies, which have created opportunities for Afro-Brazilians and other marginalized groups.
I've read about those policies, like the quotas for university admissions and government jobs. It seems like a really proactive way to address historical inequalities.
They've been incredibly impactful. They've increased access to education and employment, but have also helped raise the visibility and social standing of non-white Brazilians. It's a powerful example of how intentional policy changes can drive social progress.
It's amazing to see how different countries have dealt with their racial histories in such different ways. We've talked about the Dominican Republic creating this binary system, and Brazil embracing racial mixing while still struggling with white privilege. I'm curious to hear about Argentina and Costa Rica, those white nations the study highlighted.
They represent a model that's closer to the traditional European concept of whiteness, as we talked about earlier. They historically implemented policies to whiten their populations, which has had a lasting impact on their demographics.
Right. A larger percentage of their population identifies as white compared to other Latin American countries. But even within those white nations, it seems like there's a growing awareness of the need for change.
Exactly. There's a growing movement to reclaim indigenous and Afro-Latin American identities and challenge those historical narratives that have erased their contributions.
So they're starting to dismantle those old hierarchies and build a more inclusive national identity that reflects the true diversity of their populations.
You said it. And this is part of a bigger trend across Latin America, as countries grapple with their colonial legacies and strive for a more just and equitable future.
This deep dive has been so eye-opening. We've seen how different countries have dealt with their racial pasts in such different ways, and how younger generations are pushing for a more inclusive understanding of race. But I can't help but wonder, what does this all mean for the future of race in Latin America?
That's a great question to ponder as we wrap up this segment of our deep dive. We'll continue this discussion and explore potential future trends in the final part.
Welcome back to our deep dive into whiteness in Latin America. We were talking about how different countries are dealing with their racial histories, and it seems like younger generations are really pushing for a more inclusive and equitable future. But I'm still left wondering, what does all of this mean for the future of race in Latin America?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's one that researchers are still grappling with. But this study, it gives us some variable clues, though. One of the most hopeful things is that whiteness, it's not this fixed or monolithic category.
Okay.
It's shaped by so many different factors: history, culture, social status, even individual interactions.
Wow.
That means it's not set in stone.
So there's potential for change. That's encouraging to hear.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
As societies evolve, as younger generations come of age with new perspectives, as these countries confront their pasts and work towards more inclusive societies, the meaning and significance of whiteness, it will likely continue to change.
It's like we're witnessing a renegotiation of racial identities, like in real time. How exciting.
It really is. And I think a few key things will shape this renegotiation. We've already seen the impact of affirmative action policies in Brazil, like those quotas for university admissions and government jobs.
Right.
Do you think we'll see similar policies adopted in other parts of Latin America?
I'm not sure, but it seems possible. As awareness of racial inequality grows and as social movements gain momentum, I think there will be more pressure on governments to address these issues through policy.
Yeah, policy changes are vital.
Yeah.
But we also need a shift in attitudes and beliefs about race. We have to address those deep-seated structures that continue to perpetuate inequality. It's not enough to just change the laws. We need to change hearts and minds.
It sounds like it needs to be like a two-pronged approach. Top-down policy changes and bottom-up social transformation.
Exactly.
That seems like a tall order.
It is, but I think it's achievable. This study really highlights how important it is to understand the everyday dynamics of race, those subtle interactions and experiences that shape our identities and reinforce hierarchies.
Right, like we discussed earlier, people were more likely to identify as white when the interviewer had darker skin. It's a small detail, but it reveals so much about how fluid these categories are and how they're constantly being negotiated in our interactions with others.
It's those subtle dynamics that
Yeah.
we need to pay attention to. We have to challenge those implicit biases and unconscious assumptions that perpetuate inequality. It's not always easy to recognize those biases in ourselves.
No, it's not. It's about unlearning those ingrained patterns of thinking that uphold white privilege. That's a lifelong process.
It is. It requires constant vigilance,
Yeah.
a willingness to listen, a commitment to learning and growing, and a dedication to creating a more just world.
Wow. It's been incredible to explore these ideas with you today. It's clear that whiteness in Latin America, it's this ever-evolving concept. It's shaped by history, culture, and social forces. We've learned how national narratives and political strategies have shaped racial identities, and how younger generations are pushing for a more inclusive future.
What's most striking to me is that despite the long shadow of colonialism and the ongoing fight for racial justice, there's a sense of hope in Latin America, a possibility for a future where race is no longer a barrier to opportunity or a source of division.
Yeah, I agree. By understanding the complexities of race, we can start to dismantle those systems of oppression and build a more equitable society. That's what makes this kind of deep dive so valuable. It helps us challenge our assumptions and see the world in new ways.
Well said. I think that's a great place to leave our conversation today.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to keep exploring these issues. Learn more about the diverse histories and cultures of Latin America. Listen to the voices of those who are challenging the status quo. And consider how you can contribute to building a more just and equitable world.
Until next time,
Yeah.
keep diving.